I think most of y'all have been here before, or most of the day. I'm Tim Reinders, Design Specialist, Main Street, Iowa.
And I'm Maya Jessen, also a Design Specialist with Main Street, Iowa.
Tonight, or the rest of the afternoon or early evening, we're going to do a quick presentation kind of on design committee roles and responsibilities. I've got a number of handouts on your table. We've got a little word find game there that, find the word in the grid. That's just a thing to keep you occupied ahead of time. The handout with the cartoons on it is one that we use for training, and this has really got the guts of what we're going to talk about tonight during the presentation. So we've got a number of copies of these. Take the extra ones if you want to distribute them, make more copies of them, all of that. But this is the gist of what we're going to talk about during the presentation. So if you've already read this, you already know all the stuff we're going to talk about. And then this handout is also a checklist that we use over time, and this is kind of the gamut of what design committee activities typically are in Main Street. We'll talk a little bit about this. This is in the presentation as well, but one key thing to remember when you look at this particular checklist, it's not that you have to do everything that's on this all the time. It's that these are the kinds of issues that design committees typically look at in a Main Street community. So when you're looking at, okay, what are we supposed to be thinking about? You can maybe pull this out and say, well, geez, we're dealing with, we talked about public improvements today, streetscape stuff, all right? So that falls under the gamut of the design committee. It's not that you have to do all of these things all the time. Like, for instance, historic preservation activities, a lot of times the Certified Local Government Preservation Commission or the Historical Society might be addressing a lot of those issues, but it might be something that you can partner with them with, or provide some assistance. So it's not that the design committee per se has to do everything that's on this list all the time. This is just sort of a thing to kind of check your work plan or your activities to see if you're kind of being well-rounded. So we're going to go through a bunch of different things, and again, talking just about, particularly about design tonight. And again, that's really the physical part of the Main Street or of downtown. So both the streets and the public areas in the downtown. So if you really want to kind of divide it in those two primary components, it's the buildings, and that's all the spaces around the buildings too. So it's all the physical parts in the downtown. So when we look at building improvements, that's of course, we always start with maintenance, taking care of what's necessary in the buildings. We also talk about facades, but also about interiors and upper floor rehabs too. So it's not just the facades, even though that's predominantly what our design services look at. We do look at total rehab. And then of course, public improvements is everything else. So that's the streets, sidewalks, parking lots, green spaces, plantings, all of those other things that go into the public arena as well. Oop, I was trying to remember to go the right way. This is a quote I like to use, actually from Winston Churchill. It talks about being a building guy. I like to think that this is a fairly true statement. We shape our buildings, and afterwards our buildings shape us. I do like to believe that the physical environment does have some influence on the way we interact and act as people. Just kind of stresses the importance of the built environment. This is basically what we're going to talk about during the presentation. Really just do a quick review of what has happened downtown. You guys have probably all heard this before from different presentations that we've done here in the past. But then we're really going to talk about these four areas: the roles and responsibilities and activities of the committee, education, working with buildings, guiding design and partnering, and then we've got the committee checklist. So this is really the guts of what we're going to talk about tonight, are these four areas of roles and responsibilities for the committee. I went the wrong way again. And then we don't have to worry about action plan. We did that earlier today. So that's just on there from previously. Main Street is economic development in the context of historic preservation. And when we say historic preservation, that brings a lot of connotations, sometimes not always positive to a lot of people. When we say preservation, they always think about, it's only stuff like the National Register, and There's lots of rules and regulations and requirements and red tape and restrictions, and Big Brother's gonna come in and tell you what you can and can't do. That's what preservation's all about. Well, when we talk about preservation, it's a lot broader than that. You know, I always say there's a difference between preservation with a capital P, historic preservation, and small p preservation. Yeah, what we're doing is recycling the buildings and using them in an effective way, and that's really what we're all about with preservation. So here are some examples, you know, that you could talk about from some different textbooks and things that are out there. You know, preservation is all about creating this link and these memories from our past and passing them on to succeeding generations. So it's creating this continuity of who we are as a people and as a community. That's just as much preservation as the building themselves. And of course, then identification, protection, enhancement of historic resources. That's kind of the generic, out of the box definition of historic preservation that everybody uses. And then this is a lot of also what we're about here too, is this last one. Careful management of communities' historic resources and avoidance of wasted resources by careful planning and use. In other words, just being smart about buildings and amenities that we've got in our community and being wise about how we use them. And this is a cartoon that I found some time ago that I like to talk about too, because a lot of times preservation is a matter of perspective. What's important to you may not be important to the next person. And this is a good cartoon that illustrates it. This Blondie cartoon. Blondie and Dagwood are standing out in front of this little train station, and Blondie says, you know, they're gonna knock that down, you know. And so Dagwood just starts going crazy. He says, no, not that old train station. You know, what's wrong with our country? You know, these days nobody cares about preserving our past. We're living in this disposable society. So what trendy little shop are they gonna put in its place? And Blondie says, well, they're putting up one of those giant home improvement stores. And Dagwood goes, wow, a giant home improvement store? How soon can they get the pile of bricks out of here? You know, so a lot of times it's all relative. You got to kind of know what battle you're fighting a lot of times when it comes to preservation and what sort of hot buttons there are when we're talking about certain issues. So again, it's a matter of perspective. What's important to one person may not be important to the other person up and down the street. You know, when we look at how our downtowns were developed over time, you know, you can get your old plat maps out. This is an old Sanborn map. If you guys aren't familiar with Sanborn maps, they're really cool old insurance maps to look at the way downtowns were platted. And you can see that, you know, we've got these long, skinny lots up around this particular one is a square. You know, here we've got the linear Main Street along Avenue G. Is that right? But one thing you always see is the skinny lots, and you know, why did they have skinny lots that we platted? Do you know this?
I don't know if I do. Did I say that?
Well, it was, you know, on a frontage you could sell more lots if you made them skinny. So the entrepreneurs, when the railroad came in, said, well, we're only going to sell you 22 feet because I can sell you, I can sell more of those lots instead of selling a 50-foot lot. You know, I can sell twice as many if I make them 25 foot wide. The other thing that we see when we look at bays, and that 20 to 24 foot span was also the span of lumber and construction at the time. So there was a couple reasons why we got buildings that are about that scale. Not that that really makes any difference in anything, but that's just kind of the way it was. But that results in this kind of rhythm that we get up and down the street, those narrow lots, you know, so we get these bays, these beats as you walk up and down the street. It really led to this pedestrian scale that whether or not it was intended, those 24-foot rhythms of storefront after storefront after storefront made everything very pedestrian oriented, and I don't think it was really that intention, but that's how it ended up. And that's what makes downtowns, you know, what they were. Then of course we all know what happened, World War II, the sprawl, invention of the interstate highway, everything migrated outside of downtown, and the whole thing that we changed about the way we looked at, even the way we put our buildings together changed because it was all based on the automobile and how we looked at those. And then of course the mall sucked all the life out and again changed the way we looked at the types of retailing that we did over time. And then we went and tried to modernize our downtown to make it look like the mall, right? You know, because the mall was successful, so we made it look like everything looked like the mall. You guys have probably seen all this stuff before. You know, here's the before picture of the cool little building. You know, we need to make it look like the mall. And what that did is we ended up then tin canning whole downtown sometimes. It lost its architectural character, its walkability, and the pedestrian scale. The scale of that down, the humanizing element that those buildings had before was all gone because we thought if we just made it all look like the mall, we'd be successful. And that bottom picture, you can really see when you look at that yellow building all by itself, just how different the proportions are when we don't have the windows back on all those other buildings. And we didn't think that that was such a big deal when we did that, that nobody cares about any of that stuff. Everybody wants to look like the modern new things, but over time we've realized that, again, as that Winston Churchill quote, we really relate to our buildings and how we interact in a different way. And there's something about the pedestrian scale that really is important to us. And that's what we've got in the downtown. So that's that, again, reiterating all that history that you've probably heard a couple times before. But really, when we talk about things, these are kind of the four main areas that we're going to talk about and that you really need to work at when you look at that. There's design committee activities. Maya's going to talk about education awareness and working with individual buildings, and I'm going to talk about the last 2 points about guiding Main Street's development in the bigger scale and then partnering with others. So I'm going to turn it over to Maya now.
Okay, so moving into education and awareness. We have this listed as the first of these priorities because this is one of the fundamental things that you will do as a design committee. This is really important to your program and to the success of Main Street. We just talked for an hour and a half about the Old Baptist Church project, and what that came down to, one of the big issues right now is just education and people being aware of what's going on and what the possibilities are of that. So just education and awareness is a huge component of what you can do. Have the community understand the importance of preservation and just kind of build that preservation ethic, which can then kind of spur some of this movement and these projects going forward. And so there's a number of different ways that you can do this. We encourage you to kind of have some fun with it, find out what works best for your community. But you can do things like workshops and seminars, tours, contests, scavenger hunts, photo displays, different sorts of awards and recognition. We talked a lot about press releases today, articles. It's not on there, but using Facebook and social media to share these things. We'll go through some examples of these here, but there's a number of ways that you can choose to do this. And so here we have just some tours of the community, putting together books, pictures. We talked about sharing when you get designs back from us, sharing those with your committee, sharing those with others of kind of proper preservation methods. You can do these tours that bring your downtown to life. This is a cemetery tour, but a lot of people have done it with partnering with Halloween and things like that and doing kind of haunted tours around town. So again, kind of things that you can have fun with that get people to be interested in it, but also serve this other purpose of educating about history and the preservation of your community. We like to get youth involved if you can, doing programs at schools, the local library, museums. This is kind of doing a photo comparison or scavenger hunt. Those pictures you see in the newspaper of looking at two images and what's changed, what's different between the two. That's something that you can do with historic photos and then the actual buildings today and challenge people to see what's changed, what was there, what is there now, and kind of pick out how these buildings are changing over time. Tim had mentioned partnering maybe with the Historical Society or the Preservation Commission. There's generally a National Historic Preservation Week. I believe it's a month now in May. So that can be a good time to do some of these local activities and partner with that. Again, just some more examples of pamphlets that communities have put together, books of historic photographs, walking tours, a coloring book of historic downtown buildings, again, to get kids involved. There's a bunch of different ways you can do this, and again, using online avenues now as a way of doing this, having apps on your phone for walking tours, things on your website, different ways like that to get people out and seeing these things in the community. this is a way to just highlight some of your historic buildings, and Tim will talk a little bit more about this in public improvements later. But highlighting some of these historic buildings, maybe you have some more of the history of the building on these ones, or some of these just highlighting that this is a historic building, it's on the National Register of Historic Places, or it's a local landmark. Having some of that information about these buildings that people, when they're walking around, can see and identify with, and learn a little bit more about their community. And then doing some special events and presentations and awards, kind of as you guys get going and as some of these projects start to happen. It's really important to recognize these things on the local level, recognize some of these projects that are happening, some of the people, and that just helps gain community awareness and get people excited about what they're doing. This is another option for tours that can be really, really great opportunities for communities, letting people see some of these kind of behind the scenes places, whether it's some of those private second floor apartments that we talked about that you don't usually get to go up to, buildings that are in progress, that are being worked on, even places that are completely vacant. Just getting people up there to say, hey, this could be an opportunity, look how cool this space is. I know we've talked about the telephone company, the building above Frederick's, just getting people up there and seeing that space and how amazing that space is. Those can be really neat tours and things that you can do. So then moving into working with individual buildings, and this is kind of a long section that we'll just breeze through, so don't get overwhelmed by all the technical terms, but this will just show you some of the examples of the terms that we talk about and work with. So the first step of this, which doesn't require any sort of technical knowledge or any design expertise, is just really getting out and getting acquainted with your downtown. You all live here, you see these buildings on a daily basis, but sometimes, as we talked about earlier, you're too close to things. So really get out and look more closely at your downtown, look at differences in buildings, look at differences in materials. Are there upper stories? Are they in use? Kind of what's going on with these buildings. And then looking again at historic photographs and starting to look at a little closer at some of these details. Like this awning that was put in here kind of covers a large portion of a facade, but if you look a little closer, you can see that original column of the storefront. And so maybe then you can kind of look a little more, look on the inside of a building, and maybe that's a sign that there's some more of that storefront underneath there. So really starting to pick out some of these little aspects that might get hidden by some of these alterations and things that have occurred over time to the buildings. And when you're doing this, getting acquainted with the downtown, one of the first things that we really recommend for the design committee to do is get a photo inventory of every building in your district, the exteriors of every building, interiors, get upstairs if you can. Just get as many photos as you can, because things change really quickly as you start doing projects, as things change. So it's really good to have that inventory of how things look now, and then remember to continue that as buildings are changing, as things are happening. So you really have this record of how things have occurred over time. Like it says here, straight on elevation shots are best if you can get out in the early morning before the cars are on the street. So you have the best shots of the buildings that you can get. And then we mentioned it's also really nice if you can get a historic photo collection of the downtown. And maybe that's something too you can work with the Historical Society for. But these photos really help guide good preservation work. We like them when we're doing renderings to be able to reference back and see the building in its original state, and that kind of helps us, gives us some clues as to what's going on and how we want to aim with preservation projects. And then along with the photo inventory, we recommend doing a building information inventory of every property. This is a helpful base that just has kind of basic information, property, owners, the use of the business, assessor info, you see assessed value, zoning, taxes, just all that basic info that you can use going forward. And this is something that your business improvement or economic vitality committee now, we should change that. This is something that they also have a hand in, so this is something you may want to partner with them to see if they're working on it, and really get in and out of every building, do the upper floors, make note of where you have available space, underutilized space, and this is something that you can use when you have new business opportunities or somebody looking for a space. You can access this inventory and say, you know, I think we have a spot here that could be a really good fit for this, and you've got all that information on hand.
Just curious, how many of you have been in the telephone building space that we were talking about?
I wish no one would have. I wanted that building burning.
See, but that's again what Maya was talking about, you know, you need to know what the buildings are like in your community so you can have a better handle of what the opportunities are.
Well, has anybody seen a lot of these pictures going around on Facebook, like the from like I lived
where
in?
I grew up.
Yeah, I grew up in
just
Grundy
contacted
County.
that guy today because I have no pictures
Because-
of my building. And he
Yeah,
doesn't
and when
either.
you just said that it's helpful for you to have pictures of the original buildings, there's a lot
I'm not sure what
that I think,
I'm not sure.
are
I
on
just
that.
inboxed him.
yeah,
lot
like
on
that they're
there.
sharing. There's a
Every
lot of
single day at
pictures on
least.
there
Okay.
that have like the old pictures of downtown, like from different angles and different blocks and stuff, and it would be really helpful.
That would be really good to collect and.
And I don't know where he's getting them all from,
I don't either.
but somebody's posting, you know, on that I grew up in
Some of them
Grundy.
are like even, I think it's the Library of Congress.
Yeah.
Is that where they're
That's
coming
site,
from?
But there's some that I've seen on there I haven't seen. Because
Okay.
we went through that when we did the Main Street application. And a lot of those are those pictures, but there's additional ones that he's posted.
Yeah, there's some really neat ones of like different blocks of
Older
downtown
ones
and
than
old.
what we even had seen.
The old college, some
Yes.
of those.
Yeah, I mean like even when it was like still a dirt road.
Or like look that way, and I saw pictures
Yeah.
that way before I bought it on there.
I was just thinking like if we could figure out how to get you
Yeah.
some of that, if you could look at it, then you could have a better idea of what's underneath.
Or even just having those on file in your local office,
Mhm.
and then when we come and we're looking at a specific building, they can pull that, Kristen or the design committee, can pull that photo for that specific
Yeah.
project. So yeah, that would be a great, if you
I
could
don't
get some
know
of
how to
those
get it.
to get started.
She just likes the page on Facebook about this too.
Yeah, okay, awesome. Well, we'll move into, this is where I mentioned it's gonna get a little bit technical, so bear with me. But just to give you kind of a basic understanding of buildings, I know you won't have this vocabulary all the time. We mentioned earlier going around on our visits and bringing design committee members. But this will give you kind of a basic understanding of historic commercial architecture. So when we look at our buildings downtown, they've all kind of evolved in different ways. They have different elements, but they're basically the same basic format. We've got kind of a three-part structure with the storefront, of course, on street level. We have upper floor windows. Sometimes they're 2 stories, 3, sometimes 4 or more. And then you've got this kind of decorative cornice band at the top. So pretty much all of your buildings, when you look at them downtown, will follow this basic structure. And then if we zoom in a little bit on the storefront, maybe. Uh-oh. We got zoomed out here. There we go. Okay. So if you zoom in at the storefront, again, these will all have similar elements. Historically, commercial storefronts had recessed entrances, like you see here. These panels at the bottom are called kick plates or bulkheads. You've got your storefront display windows, and then they had this band of transom windows, which we were
Yeah.
talking about earlier today. And a lot of those often had awnings covering them. And then again, you have a cornice band, oftentimes separating the storefront from those upper story windows. So a lot of these buildings have changed over time, and that leads to a lot of the issues that we look at with exterior rehabilitation. And you can see kind of the main things that we deal with here, and we'll go through examples of all of these. But we'll look at painting, the masonry and stone issues. We've talked about how maintenance is kind of foremost for your buildings and keeping that up. We'll look at upper facade problems. There's a lot of window alterations, cornices that have been removed or damaged, slip covers that have been put on buildings. And then we'll look at some issues specific to the storefronts and how those have been altered. Look at some other materials, signs, and some awnings and canopies. So paint is one of those things that we use a lot of because it's a pretty easy, relatively low-cost solution that can make a big impact, for better or for worse sometimes. You can see in these examples that they've used paint to highlight some of these building details we've talked about up on the cornice, the window hoods. This has a decorative metal facade that has a lot of elements to it. So you can really use paint to call attention to that and bring the eye up to some of these details in the building. But you have to be kind of careful about the paint you're selecting. These ones are a little more vibrant than we, to put it
You don't have to be
nicely,
so politically correct.
than what we would typically recommend. So just use some caution when you're picking hues and tones for paint. One of the things we typically never recommend painting a brick building that hasn't been painted. That's not good for the brick. But if it has already been painted, oftentimes it can be damaging to remove it. So a lot of the times we will recommend, they used a very red here, but putting back a color on there that is reminiscent of that original brick color. But most of the time we'll be using paint to highlight these details that you see here. Looking at masonry and stone, again, these are just some maintenance issues that occur when buildings aren't being properly maintained, when brick isn't being repointed. Often you get a lot of moisture issues, you get spalling where layers are peeling off of the brick. None of that is good and just leads to more moisture in the building. So proactive maintenance and getting to that before this happens is what we prefer, but obviously we see a lot of this sort of damage also that can be repaired. These are some just examples of cornices and other details. You can see they vary quite a bit, but really make a statement for the buildings. There's a lot of decorative elements in those, and they can be made out of a number of materials, metal or wood, or sometimes stone. And then upper floor windows are generally one of the most altered pieces of a building. They're one of the things that tends to become a huge issue in preservation projects. People remove them over time. They switch them out for newer, better, more energy efficient windows that they're being told are better for the building. But you can see that it really changes the character a lot. We had these big openings on the second floors originally, and when people try to get some of that energy efficiency and put in smaller windows, you can see what that does. It really doesn't fit the opening, it really doesn't fit the building, and it has a huge impact from the street level when you're looking up and see you have these half boarded in windows, or in this case, full boarded in windows next to some of these replacements. And at least these replacements here we're keeping with the size and the scale of the original windows. Slip covers. Tim talked about the modernization and how that occurred pretty commonly, and slip covers were put on a lot during that, or as a remedy for deferred maintenance that we talked about. Sometimes you get lucky with these, like you can see here, the original facade is still intact underneath that, and it's just installed with these anchors that you can remove with little damage. So that's one of the things. I believe you took this picture from a second floor window.
Mhm.
Just leaning out there, you could see that that whole facade was there. So a lot of the times these can be removed pretty painlessly. and get back to that original facade. So then we get back to storefronts. You can see some of these slip covers that occurred. These ones weren't the early on modernization that occurred, but some later alterations. In this one, you can tell that the original columns are here in the storefront windows, so you have kind of an idea that some of this storefront is still there. This one, the first time I looked at it, I assumed that there was nothing behind this. But Tim said actually this is underneath here. When you look from the interior, you can see that entire storefront. And they just boarded up right above it. You can kind of see where that entrance door would be. And then they just put that window right over the door. So sometimes you get very, very lucky, I would say, in that case. A lot of the times you don't, but some of these elements would still be there, like the columns, maybe some of this framing to show you where the windows were. So then you can stick in kind of some replicas of how that would have been originally with some modern materials. And with the storefronts, we talked about the recessed entrances. You can see here sometimes they were double storefronts that were pretty far recessed. This was just a shallow one. Sometimes you have really nice tile entrances. So you kind of have to dig a little bit. Sometimes that stuff is hiding under there. Sometimes you're lucky and it's still exposed. Again, kick plates. These areas, just because of where they're located, they get a lot of wear and tear and damage, whether from pedestrians, from elements, from shoveling snow and things like that. So really durable materials work best here, whether it's wood, like these images on the left, or tile, like on the right. We don't recommend purple shag carpet, like in this application. Doesn't really hold up well, leads to some other issues.
It's kind of retro.
A little bit, but kind of gross too. So then these are those transom windows again. Here's some examples. These come in a number of different forms. These ones have the little prism glass tiles, but they can be larger single panes that would cover these openings. A lot of the times we were walking around earlier today trying to find an example of these, and infill panels have been put in all the spots where transoms would be. But there may be some underneath those. That's one of the things that you just don't really know what's there until you start pulling away at some of that stuff.
What was the original purpose of those? Just for light?
Yeah.
So why did they put awnings over them
Too much light.
Well, it's like,
To modernize it.
I mean, it's a some
Modern.
control issue,
Yeah.
you know, because this is an operable awning. You know, the old awnings were all operable.
then? Oh.
Okay. And then that diffused the light, and then this would provide the shade when you needed it and let the light in when you wanted it.
With that narrow long building, having that extra light in there would really help a lot. So yeah, sometimes these are underneath there. Sometimes you can poke up through your ceiling tiles and look forward and see if anything's there. If not, again, those can be replicated as well. But it is pretty neat to find those original pieces, and those can be repaired if you do have them. There's specialty contractors that can do that work as well. Structural glass, I think we also talked about at your storefront. These were materials in the 1930s, 20s, 30s, 40s that were popular to modernize storefronts. And these are interesting in that at first look you'd say that doesn't really match the character of the original building. You know, you can see the early brick facade up top and then this modern facade there. But one of the things with preservation is that there's different time periods that are significant. So looking at these materials, you know, those have a special significance in themselves. So it's not always that we need to peel everything off and go back to the original building. Sometimes these elements themselves can be retained and restored. We can do a whole hour-long workshop on signs, but there's a ton of examples of signs that you can see, whether they're flush mount signs, whether they stick out. You can have a lot of fun with those. And then awnings and canopies, as Tim mentioned, historically they were operable to provide for sun or shade. You can do either ones now, but they can provide a lot of color to downtown as well as being useful, especially if you have sun issues. But awnings can also disguise inappropriate alterations. We'll recommend them a lot in places where the transoms have been filled over. And if a full restoration of those isn't possible, sometimes an awning can cover that inappropriate alteration and give a better appearance from the street. But they should always fit the openings they cover. You know, a rectangular opening, a rectangular awning, and there should at least always be an opening to cover and not just an awning put on the side of a building for added color or whatever that may be.
Stranger things.
So with this, we look to the local design committee to help locally with some design advice. We try to come as often as we can, but we're only here a few times of the year, so we really rely on you guys to help with that. Some of the things you can do are helping people find contractors, suppliers for different things, maybe helping to organize bids and estimates, helping with applications, if it's grant applications, that sort of stuff, assisting with labor. Here's again finding some suppliers and craftsmen. And for this really specialized stuff, you can come to us and we can help find recommendations if it's not available locally. And then just kind of doing hands-on projects, being a labor supply here. We had talked about at the Old Baptist Church, just in 2 hours, what was done with some volunteer work this fall and getting all the greenery out of there. You can do the same thing with a building, whether it's painting, tearing down one of those slipcovers, seeing what's there. You can really do a lot with some volunteer hours. And then of course you have Tim and I and the rest of the Main Street Iowa team to provide some design assistance. So we can come and visit with property owners, provide renderings for facades, floor plans for upper story housing, help with a number of topics like that. We can come back and do trainings and workshops. Like I said, this is a really fast overview, but most of these things we could come do a whole hour talk on themselves. And then just provide some more resources and materials. So this is kind of more getting into the services that we provide, the technical assistance, helping with advice on tax credits, public improvement projects, and then these are just some of the examples of what you'll get from us. There's a rendering of the project along with our notes, and then this is in a packet with a ton of handouts and extra technical information for whatever kind of issues you're dealing with your project.
There's kind of examples of the scope of all the different stuff that we do. You see a sign there, facade, a back patio, and some space planning.
Now that was a lot of information. I'm gonna hand it over to Tim, but are there any immediate questions? Okay. All right, so when we talk about guiding Main Street's development, that's really sort of another way to say that design management. We're sort of being the overseers of what's happening in your downtown. And sort of like understanding or getting acquainted with your downtown, one of the things you have to realize when you look at your downtown is that your downtown wasn't designed or developed in a snapshot. There's going to be a continuum of buildings and building types and architectural styles. So we don't just have all buildings from between 1890 and 1915. You know, things have happened over time and things have evolved a little bit like Maya talked about. You know, you might have some, Romanesque buildings and Victorian buildings. You might even be lucky enough to have some really old wood frame buildings, but you've probably got some buildings from the 20s and maybe even up into the 40s and 50s. And we know we've got those buildings all through our downtown, and they're all important. They're all part of the history of our community, and we need to, even though they may not be our favorites, we have to appreciate them for what they are, okay?
So that's all part of what we have. I get accused of that all the time. This mid-century stuff isn't my favorite stuff as far as an architectural style, but I have to appreciate it for what it is, and that it is part of what's happened in those communities where it occurs. So that same thing here. Here's these are all Grundy Center examples. These are some pictures of some of the components in your buildings. The range of era. Here you've got 1880. This is right across from the courthouse. Then you've got stuff like Manley Drug and Frederick Furniture and the theater, which are more mid-century things that also need to be appreciated again for what they are. That they have their own significance in and of itself. But may not, again, be our favorite stuff, but again, that's part of the evolution of what we've had in our downtown over time. So we need to appreciate them for what they are, whether or not it's really our favorite thing, that is this layering of our history. Our downtown has been built over time, and it needs to kind of express that. We're not creating a theme park in the downtown. This is a living, breathing entity that needs to reflect that development and things that have happened over time. We used to get that with Spencer. Everybody knows about the big fire in Spencer in, 1928, from fireworks. When we first started working with Spencer, they said, oh God, yeah, we said, you got some really cool stuff, because, they rebuilt downtown Spencer between 1929 and 1931. Well, what happened right then? That was the onset of the Depression, right? Nobody else was rebuilding in the Midwest, but they rebuilt their downtown. So they have this really cool, Art Deco, Spanish Revival, Mediterranean Revival architecture in their downtown that nobody else has, because that was the style that was popular at that time. And they always would say, oh, you used to see our really cool Victorian stuff that all burned down. But it took them like 20 years before they appreciated that 1929 to 1933 architecture that they have now as a National Register district, and they play it all up with their Art Deco downtown. So after a while, people come to appreciate that stuff. So part of this is planning for preservation. It's developing the long-term plans, putting the tools in place, whether those be ordinances, guidelines, policies, procedures, working with the Preservation Commission and the Historical Society in the city to set your priorities into what's important in your downtown and understanding what our community is and what we want to save. Again, not harping on the old Baptist church, but saying, all right, that is an important resource in our community, it's worth saving. What are we going to put up resources to do that? Is that important to us or not? As a community, those are community decisions. And putting those tools in place to make sure those things happen. Lots of different ways you can do that. Coming up with a historic preservation plan or some kind of design regulations or design guidelines. These are things that, sometimes are dirty words when we talk about design regulations and controlling what people do to their buildings. People think, oh, that's Big Brother. You're going to tell me what you can or can't do to your building. But we've got design regulations already in place in our community, whether or not we really realize it. If you've got a sign ordinance, that's a design regulation. You've got site requirements when you put, especially if you build a house, you've got setback requirements and things like that. Those are design regulations. Those are so ingrained in what we think about, we don't think of them as design regulations because that's just the way we're accustomed to do business. But when we start talking about, oh, we're going to put design guidelines and design ordinances in the downtown, everybody goes, oh, that's Big Brother, and it's, you guys are coming in and tell us what we can and can't do. No, it's just kind of taking those things and moving them on a little bit further of a continuum. So those are just something that people need to understand when you look at that. And when we look at guidelines, we talk about sort of 3 levels of guidelines that we look at. There's lots of sources for them that we'll talk about too. But basically what we start with is these voluntary guidelines. That's like when Maya and I come in and we provide design services. And, wouldn't it be cool if you did this to your building? And, it's sort of like convincing somebody to make their investment in that proper way. That's voluntary guidelines. Totally just by doing the right thing because it's the right thing. Well, sort of the next level is incentive-based guidelines. So like with your big grants. So if I'm going to get a grant from you, I have to meet your expectations. It's a carrot and a stick approach. I spend my own money as long as I meet codes and regulations. I can do whatever I want. I want some money from you, well, now you've got more say in what I do. You know, you can raise my standards up and elevate my expectations because you're helping, you know, to finance that project. And that's totally appropriate, and that's what you should do when you've got incentives up there. Then you get into mandatory guidelines, and that's requirements. You know, so whenever you get a building permit, you have to go through a design review body, you know, get approval for whatever you do. You see that in places, you know, you get to some places where they even mandate what kind of color paint you're gonna have, you know, but mandatory design review, like Dubuque has mandatory design review, you know, in their historic districts. We've got very well-articulated guidelines, but everything you do when you get a building permit has to go through some review process. And usually what happens is you start going through that in a continuum. You know, people start to see some change, you know, you do some incentive-based things, then all of a sudden the people that have done this don't want somebody coming in and doing something that's gonna mess up their investment. So having a more mandatory guideline system is a way to protect the investments that have been made before and make sure that the quality that you've implemented is maintained. So that's kind of how that usually works on a continuum. You know, it's kind of a process. You don't really want to jump right into this stuff hard and heavy right away if you haven't had a history of getting these things done in the past and a history of good success and high quality implementation. And we've got examples, you know, we always use the Secretary of the Interior Standards as our basic guidelines. The National Main Street Center also has lots of guidelines. We've got tech notes, we call them, that are also basically design guidelines, you know, ways to do storefronts, the stuff that Maya was showing you when you start, you know, talk about working with individual buildings. And we just put those in handouts, those are basically guidelines. You know, and then we start looking at actually developing design guidelines, which is something that, you know, is maybe down the road if you want to tailor them to your own specific local community. These are some of the issues that you start looking at, you know. What's the scale and massing of our buildings? How do they sit on the site? You know, what is our window patterns up on our buildings? You know, what kind of materials and detailing and style? And you can see in these three different blocks that you might have, the infill or what should be in each of these spaces is a little bit different because the context is a little bit different. So when you talk about how to apply guidelines, you have to understand where it is and what our buildings are like in our downtown. It's not just pure one size fits all. You kind of have to assess and analyze your district to say what's appropriate. You know, like you guys wouldn't want an 8-story building plopped right downtown. I mean, that would look kind of weird, right? You know, there's nothing probably to prevent that from happening, you know, but that's not really the context of your downtown, right? So that's kind of why, you know, that's part of doing that assessment or analysis, understanding those principles. These are design guidelines actually from the new town development in Ankeny. And using lots of pictures usually helps people understand what's going on. But this is for new construction in the Prairie Ridge, Prairie Trails area in Ankeny, if you guys are familiar with that. But it's all new construction, all new development. And the cool thing is, or kind of the ironic thing is they've gone around and they've taken pictures of historic buildings in places like Valley Junction and Marshalltown and downtown Newton and East Village. And those are the examples that they're using for these new construction elements in this new town development. So, you know, the real thing is what people are attracted to. We're understanding, you know, that that's what people really relate to, and we're seeing that being mimicked in new construction. So it really says a lot about the importance of what we do and what we're doing in downtown. Now, this is one of these things that we put up here. This is a picture that was actually up there before. This is a replacement window thing, and this is where you really can get really deep into the weeds when we start talking about doing design review and appropriate rehabilitation and things like that, okay? So this is a new window that was put in this building right over here, and here's the historic window. Do those windows match?
Not exactly.
No. But it's hard for you guys to see on there, but when they submitted this, I'm sure to the commissioner, to the review body, they said, oh, these windows are gonna look just like the old ones. We've got 4 vertical panes here. You can barely see these lines back there. And we've got 2 up here. There's one right here that you can barely see back there, right? So when they probably submitted a drawing to the review body, said, look, this window's gonna look just like those windows we're taking out. Well, they don't. Okay, now is that a deal breaker? I don't know. You know, if you're really anal about the way those windows look, yeah. Could it have been a lot worse? Sure. You know, but that's where you get into the really weeds about what's appropriate and what's inappropriate. You know, kind of how far on that continuum are you gonna review these types of things. So, you know, windows are a huge deal. The building looks different with these new replacement windows. I don't care what they say. You know, this is not quite the same thing. Should that be a deal breaker? Yeah, I don't know. You know, that's a local decision. You know, it's like how high up are you going to raise the bar for expectations? Because you can find somebody that'd make a new window that would look just like that old one. So one of the things that you do to try to create that, you know, atmosphere for reinvestment is to create incentives and market those. And again, you guys have the big grants that are out there, and that's great and wonderful. You know, we've got tools at our office that we talked about, like the DTR grants and challenge grants and things like that. Sometimes, you know, they can be low interest loans. Sometimes you can even provide services at no cost. You know, some communities will waive permit fees or hookup fees or things like that that isn't really giving necessarily a cash incentive, but it's deferring fees and other costs that are also little tools that you can provide to create incentives that'll help people. And sometimes it's even just as much as putting listings together. That's a good thing for the local program to do, of incentives that are out there. These are the tools that are available from our community. These are things that we know we can get from the state, et cetera, you know, to help property owners understand the different things that are out there. So different examples of how to do that, and even just sort of letting them know even where to look, and we can help you with some of that as well. But there's money out there and there's incentives out there. You just got to know how to do it or what they're targeted for. But I always say too, which you don't want to fall into the mistake of molding your project to fit a funding source. Right? You will want to have a project and then try to find a funding source that matches what you're trying to do. Now you can tweak it a little bit, of course, but you don't want to sort of, you know, let your the tail wag the dog, so to speak, when you're looking at, you know, just because there's money out there, you don't want to sell the farm, so to speak, to get a money source. You want to make sure it fits your goals. One of the other things that is really a big emphasis right now at the agency and across the country is the whole issue of sustainability. You know, LEED certification and all those different types of things, and lots of all this going green stuff that's out there. And you know, greenwashing is what it's been called now. I mean, everybody's doing green. You know, one of the most ironic things is the vinyl window guys that talk about how green the product is. You know, there's nothing more toxic than the creation of vinyl. You know, it's one of the most toxic materials in the world. You know, promoting that as a green element is just sort of ironic, and I find that really funny. But you know, so everybody tries to tag that their stuff is green, I guess is the point. But it is something that, you know, we really push. But one of the things that we always believe that we push is that, you know, the greenest building is one that's already there. You can't get any more green in an existing building. And matter of fact, that derelict building grant program you guys applied for is directly a result of this statistic down there. Construction and demolition waste is one of the biggest contributors to our landfills, not only in Iowa but across the country. So one of the things the Department of Natural Resources is trying to do is divert stuff out of our landfills, because our landfills are filling up, you know, at ever increasing rate. So if we can keep construction and demolition materials out of the landfill, you know, they're going to last us longer. So that was the whole reason why that whole program was started, was to recycle those different types of materials. And you know, we even convinced them to say, well, why are we even worried? You know, isn't it even better to keep materials out of the landfill if we don't tear the building down at all, as opposed to recycling the materials after we tear the building down? Let's not even tear the building down. Doesn't that keep more materials out of the landfill? They said, well, I guess you're right. You know, so now we can at least get that. When they first launched that program, keeping the building wasn't even an option. So, but that's one thing that we really believe in, is that it's just smart to use those resources, you know, because that's the greenest way to go. Even if the building, whether or not it's a historic building or whether you even do a historic rehabilitation, just the investment in that infrastructure is smart to try to reuse if at all possible. All right, let's look at public spaces real quick. This is one of the other areas. We'll talk about a little bit about this afternoon. Lots of different things that come into this area. Again, this is everything outside the building, so, enhancements, looking at parking, and then other things that you can do in other public spaces, and that's stuff like, when we talk about buildings, that's usually things like performance pavilions or market pavilions and things like that, those kind of public buildings that go usually in park areas when we talk about other public space improvements. A lot of times when we look at paving and sidewalks, you can do some really neat things with insets and different colored paving to create a unique atmosphere on your streets and sidewalks. You can inset these little plaques that talk about the history of your community, railroad history. Of course, you also, everybody's pretty familiar with the donor bricks that get put in a lot of times on plazas in different areas. But that's another way to kind of create a unique character in your downtown and something that's a little bit different from everywhere else with, using some unique colors, unique paving materials with, when you're going to replace your sidewalks. Signs and directional things can also create, a unique sort of sense of arrival. These things are on in Valley Junction, which are down along Railroad Avenue. If you ever drive down Railroad Avenue in West Des Moines, they've got a number of these things in increments along the corridor before you actually get to Valley Junction. But it's the sort of progression along the road that you're going to a special place, and they've got a big gateway arch once you get to the junction. But these are these sort of clues along the way that you're coming to a special place, which is really neat. And then you get gateway pylons, and then things like this that we talked about this afternoon, directional signage that helps people find things around the downtown, around the community, wayfinding signs. I think I've got one on parking, but you can have your directional signs and your wayfinding signs really be reflective of the brand of your district or of your downtown. You don't have to just always use the generic P with an arrow. The parking lots, we can do a little bit better than that a lot of times. Public spaces, little plazas, green areas, that you can create special little spots in your downtown. You guys, of course, have the courtyard with the courthouse, which is a really neat public space that you can do. But then you can also implement things like public art, and even things like planners can become public art as well. And that's where you kind of create this unique identity for your downtown. You can have something that's a little different than everything, that's kind of out of the box, that creates a little bit more of a memory of what your downtown is about. But once you do something, you always got to remember that we got to take care of it. We got to have maintenance, one kind or another, but especially plantings. Take a lot of maintenance. We got to water them, we got to weed them, we got to plant new flowers every year, all that stuff. It's putting a planter in downtown by itself is fine, but every year something's got to happen to it. Streets and sidewalks all got to be repaired, street lights got to be painted or fixed, all those kinds of things. Here's another cartoon that I like to put up there. Public improvements, they're not all created equal. So here's this guy sells, this fiberglass simulated garbage display. If you really want to look like a big city, we can sell you this thing. Stick around your downtown. So just gotta realize that what you're buying is going to be there for quite a while. So you don't want to take the cheap way out. The benches and all those types of things are expensive, but so you want to take your time and do your homework and buy a good product for what you're going to have in your community. All right, one of the other things that we do a lot is, of course, is we want to partner with other entities or other organizations as much as we can to lighten the load, and especially to align our goals and priorities when it makes a lot of sense. And this was things like with the city, with regulations and ordinances. That's one of those things. These are actually Dubuque's design guidelines over here. And one of the things that you want to find out when you look at your local ordinances, that we found a lot of times, is that here, we've all gotten in line and we've become a Main Street community, and we have these goals of doing certain things. Like a lot of times in small towns, it's been downtown housing. But then when you start to look at the ordinances and the codes that are on the books, it may not even be allowed. We've had some small towns where downtown housing is not even allowed in the downtown. You know, so it's like, how can we do upper floor housing when it's illegal? We gotta change the ordinance. You know, our ordinances and our goals don't always align, so sometimes you have to go in, and that's the cool thing, is you can always change ordinances, of course, so. But you just need to understand that, make sure that they all fit together. So that's where you want to partner with your, you know, your city and county. There's all these other different groups that, you know, definitely have a role in our downtown revitalization, and that we can use them to our benefit. And again, one of the biggest one is with the Historic Preservation Commission. We like to have cross-population between the Design Committee and the Historic Preservation Commission whenever possible. Well, this is kind of appropriate. I didn't even realize how appropriate this is for our situation here. This is from the Des Moines Register years ago. The answer is simple, lady. Think of parking lots as historical landmarks. You know, kind of that, again, preservation perspective type of a thing, you know. We'll just put a plaque up, right, and everything will be okay. You know? No, it doesn't quite work that way, so. That was when Des Moines was going through urban renewal. That was a cartoon that was Frank Miller put in the paper. But again, once you work with the commission, you know, you can start to get your downtown designated and listed like Maya showed those plaques. To sort of create that stronger preservation ethic, to get those things out in the public realm and get people to appreciate what you've got. And then you work through, you know, getting things listed on the National Register, go through the guidelines review and enforcement of those standards that we talk about with design review. So one of those things that you want to do when you look at your resources is start to identify those and get what's significant in your community designated. And of course, some things are very obvious when you have things like, you know, a courthouse. Everybody knows that that's a historic resource, right? But not everybody is going to, you know, appreciate something like an old bread sign being kind of a cool historic resource that might have some value. And again, like places like Des Moines, the Traveler's Umbrella sign, the neon sign, that's landmarked in Des Moines. So the historic neon sign and the Colonial Bread sign, the old Colonial Bread building, that's another Des Moines landmark. Those signs are designated landmarks in the city of Des Moines. So, you know, it doesn't always have to be a building that's important to your history, I guess is the point about that. So I understand that that can all, you know, all those layers are important. All right, you guys probably, if you read your handout, you already know the answer to this, but you know, these are transom windows. A little bit of, as one of my professors used to call it, UBI, useless bit of information that we'll leave with you. Frank Lloyd Wright design in the transom windows. Don't know if you can see it very well. So right here, you kind of see the little difference in the leaded tiles. Okay. There's the rendering he did for the Luxfor Glass Company, Luxfor. He actually did 20 some of these patents that he got on these little tiles. This was the only design that was actually put into production though. Was this, I call it a spirograph design. If you guys are closer to my age, you used to have the spirograph, you know, with the cool little drawings with the little gears and the wheels.
Those were so fun.
Some of you know what I'm talking about.
Oh yeah.
But you'll see those, and that's where you see them in those windows. I'll go back, because I don't think I've got a
Isn't that
detail.
neat?
But see how those are a little bit different? That's where they're usually inset as accent tiles in these prism glass transom windows. And Luxfor tiles are usually a little bit purple when you look at them. So if you find these 4-inch leaded tiles and they're kind of purple, and they've got, again, they do have prisms on the back side. Again, you asked why they put transoms in there. Well, it was to diffuse the light. And the Luxfor prism glasses, here's another, I'm getting really building geeky now on you. But the Luxfor prisms had different angles. They have dots on them, 1 to 4 dots. And so the angles of the prisms would be different to reflect light at different angles. So when they put the transoms together, they would put a row, or they would, you know, put some ones and ones, some twos and threes and fours, so it would diffuse the light back into the store and, you know, illuminate the interior much more efficiently. Pretty sophisticated for, you know, early 1900, you know, when we didn't have, you know, nowadays we just put more lights in, right? Well, they didn't quite have that option. They'd be a little bit more smart about how to use natural light. So that's one of those, again, you can, you know, if you find some of these and you say, hey, we got a little Frank Lloyd Wright architecture, Mason City's got nothing on us, right? We have our own little Frank Lloyd Wright stuff here.
Those are at the Frederick's building as well, those windows.
Yeah.
Are they?
We went up in the chair shop,
They're in
remember?
town. They are.
That's right. Were they Luxford glass?
Yeah, and they're there.
You looked at them.
Okay.
I wanted to buy
Yeah,
that.
see here you can see. So
Now
you can actually see the woods.
everybody knows about the building, I'll never use that.
Well, when you find these, you know, like, because they're Frank Lloyd Wright tiles,
They're worth quite a bit.
you
Yeah,
find one of these and somebody wants way too much money
yeah,
for
yeah, I've heard that.
it. Way too much money. They're really cool. I wish I had some of those. I've got some plain ones in my personal collection, but I don't have any Frank Lloyd Wright Luxford tiles. All right. So again, as Maya talked about, you know, putting plaques and signs up, that's just a way to kind of mainstream preservation. You know, you can put these interpretive signs. These happen to be from West Union. You know, it's got a historic photo on one side, and then it's got a description on the other side. The other thing I always talk about these things is, you know, I'm a building geek and a building hugger, but I'm not much of a shopper. But my wife likes to shop, but I get bored easy when I go into, you know, even antique stores. But I'll read every one of those.
So you'll wander around and read the signs.
So you
while
keep
she
me
shops.
occupied. There's an ulterior motive to doing these things. You get people to spend more time in your downtown, we're gonna spend more money. Spend a little bit more money, hang around a bit longer. You're gonna spend more time at a place like the Landmark, have dinner, spend, you know, more chances to get in our pocketbook the longer somebody stays in your town. So the more you can get them to stroll, give them reasons to walk up and down your sidewalk, the better off you are. So that has multiple levels and multiple impacts too. All right, a little bit about the National Register. We don't need to go into great detail about this, but again, it's really all about getting your buildings designated, and it's a way to market your community again. And that's how you get a brown sign on the highway from DOT, Historic District, you know, and again, tourism is fine, that historic sites are one of the most visited places in our country. And people that tend to visit historic sites are wealthier and they spend more money when they visit communities than people that don't. So that's part of the, another one of the advantages about having a historic district. All right, so again, why do we even bother with all of this stuff? Kind of wrap things up here a little bit more. You know, of course, a lot of buildings are good to look at, and they're, as they call it, a gift to the street. You know, there's these kind of architectural gems. You know, and then there's buildings that we save because there's still plenty of life left in them. You know, but a lot of them are also just ways that we can be adapted, like a lot of old auto business, auto garage buildings. You know, lots of different things you can do with a building like that. But you know, they're also a link to our past and help us understand who we are. You know, how many times anymore does somebody put their name cast in stone on the top of the building when we build it? Not very often anymore, do we? People that did that 100 years ago put their names on the building. You know, it's the pride that they had. They knew that these buildings were going to be around for a long time, and they were, you know, leaving a legacy for the future. And so they put the dates and their names on these buildings. We just don't do that anymore. And here's a little thing about design guidelines and design standards from Lodo in Denver, lower downtown Denver, where the train depot and stuff is. If you guys are familiar with that area where the ballpark is, you know, it's got the tightest protections for historic buildings, the strongest design review and the most control, and yet it's the hottest real estate market there. Because if you put your money down there, you know that everybody's got to live to those same expectations. So that's why it's working. You can say, yeah, sure, you know, it's that's Denver, it's never gonna work here. But again, it creates a sense of certainty. You know, if I go in there and I do a good job, I know the guy next to me is gonna have to do a good job too. So my investment's more protected by doing that. And, you know, this is what I really think is a good statement. Lower downtown was floundering before these restrictions were put in place. Because again, nobody knew what was gonna happen, because somebody could come in, you know, and put some kind of seedy establishment right next to, if I put a multi-million-dollar establishment there, but that's created that sense of certainty and helped guide investment. So that's another reason why those kinds of controls are good. All right, again, in review, those are the four main categories that we talked about. Education awareness. If you do nothing, as Maya said, but this, as design committees, you can be successful, because if you get people to understand what we're trying to do and they do it themselves, all the much better, right? Makes your job easier. So get the word out. If nothing else, get the word out. Work with the buildings. This is a lot of what we do. Work in this public arena, and then find partners. Don't go it alone. All right, this is the list that's on your checklist. It's a little bit different than those four main categories, but you'll see that these things were all in those four categories we just talked about. This is the sheet with the yellow or the red border on the bottom. The one thing we didn't talk about at all is visual merchandising. Yeah, that one too. You just picked up. Okay. So this stuff was all in our presentation. It's just in a different format on that checklist. Okay. Just wanted to. That's why I put this slide in there. All right. So how do you get this all done? Well, we got to do our action plans or our work plans. You know, plan the work, work the plan. Get that stuff done. You know, we can talk about things, but we got to come up with a plan of action, responsibilities, budgets, all that sort of stuff. That's why we stress those things, so you get more people involved. One more quote. This is one of my favorites. This guy is some UN delegate. In the end, we preserve what we love what we understand, and we understand what we've been taught. So again, the power of that preservation education. If we teach people to be building huggers, they're going to be building huggers, and they're going to do our jobs for us. Any questions or comments? I think that's all we've got. You've got all this stuff. I didn't put my Peanuts cartoons in the slideshow tonight, but there's a couple nice Peanuts cartoons in here too that are good about preservation that I like to usually include. But take all these, if you guys want all these copies, you can distribute them. It has a lot more of the stuff in here, a lot more of the details that we didn't cover, because as Maya said, you know, we would be uber building geeky and talk about repointing for an hour, you know, the pros and cons of soft mortar and line putty mortars and spalling and all that sort of stuff. But, you know, we just didn't have enough time.
I don't know if they want to hear that.
We don't need to get that way, right?
It's kind of interesting, and just like when you grew up at that site, I grew up in Grundy County, and you look
Yeah.
at the comments that are there, and people are kind of linking
That's what I,
to the
yeah.
past. That's pretty powerful.
Mhm.
And that's like, we need to like
Yeah.
get involved in that somehow, because it's getting people excited about the old days and the way things used to look.
There's
And
so many shares.
I know.
I will tell you just the pictures, the few pictures I have up right now at my place, the stories that people have came in and the stories they told me,
Yeah.
like, I remember buying a bike here, getting air and tire here, and I made payments. I mean, just neat to see these, like, hear the old stories. It's really cool, actually. People are excited
I'm like, that's
about
like
that
what gets
stuff.
people excited about restoring these old
Mhm.
buildings,
Yeah.
you know? Make them all building huggers.
Do you realize the guy who's posting the pictures on that, who started that,
Yeah.
the page that you're talking about, he lives out east. Really? Yeah, didn't grow up here in Grundy Center, but grew up in Grundy County, on the edge of Grundy County.
And he
So,
just loves history.
he's retired, Navy.
Does he have money? That he wants
Oh, Tiffany,
I wish somebody could put the top back on the corner road.
They talked about
That's in the
it.
plan.
Yeah.
Yeah,
that's
Dave's
just-
wanted to.
Everything's possible.
I just wish somebody would rebuild the Grundy Hotel. That's a possibility.
I got the chandelier.
Huh?
I said, I have the chandelier. Yeah,
Well,
it's-
now, where was the Grundy Hotel?
Right, kitty corner from where the landmark is.
On that
Oh,
side of
okay.
the courthouse.
Because I will say this, Charles City, they talk about that too. They had a big hotel in the corner that didn't get taken out by the tornado, but got taken out a few years later. I don't know if it burned or what, but anyway, they have 5 vacant lots. They are now building a 3-story building
Yeah.
on that corner. McQuillan Place, it's gonna have, do you know how many apartments are gonna be in there? It's a lot.
Retail.
Yeah, all first floor retail, so don't, you know.
That was a sad day when they tore that down.
But, you know, so it may not be exactly the same, but doesn't mean that something else can't go back in there if the situation is right, because, you know, it's radically changing the face of downtown Charles City. If you haven't seen pictures of it, you might wanna look at it, to see how it's changing, and they never thought they were ever gonna get anything back in there. They put a skating rink in there, you know, and all this kind of stuff. They had a pocket park there. You know, they always hoped for something, but finally all the stars aligned, and, you know, the financial programs all stacked up, and they had a retired Navy guy, or no, some investor, I think from Texas, I think, that had a local connection, that said, yeah, this makes sense, we'll build this thing here. So it's in progress right now, so you never know.
Yeah, the popcorn stand's doable. That's an easy-
There's a lot of
that's an
talk of
easy
the
fix.
popcorn stand, yeah.
That's a way.
That
easy
was a
fix.
neat picture.
It's up there. Like, I think it's in the corner. Yeah, but where, I mean, where's the
Someone
stand
has it in
now?
storage.
I don't know. if
I
it's
think the
that way.
little
know that.
blue and white gas station that used to be on the highway
Yes.
north of town would make a really cool popcorn stand.
And that is
Well, it's out
west
past
of
my
town.
house.
It's
That's
supposed
just
to be
right
a
past my
diamond
house.
store
He wants to turn it into a jewelry shop.
Yeah, well, he said that like how many?
Like
That's
10
what
years
we
ago,
want.
he's been saying that, but it's right out past my
And
house.
there's money, grant money to restore gas stations.
And that was always,
Historic gas stations.
gotta tell you that, that was one of the first things that caught my eye the first few times driving through Grundy Center going to Cedar Falls was that little gas station in the north edge of town. Those are the things that catch guys, you know, building geeks like us as we drive through. And I was a little dismayed, because I also have to admit that I learned to drive, take the, as I call it, the bypass up towards your house.
Yeah.
And not drive through town that often, and then when I drove through town once and it was gone, I was dismayed, and then when I got west of town, it's like, oh,
Yeah.
thank God it still exists.
Yeah, it's out there.
Because that ought to be something that somebody figures out how to do something with.
Yeah, that would be cool.
I say eggs from us, I'll hit him up next time.
I don't think it's gonna be a jewelry store.
It's out by my
Maybe
house.
He's
Yeah,
running
it's
out.
out by hot players, but-
I don't know if he's willing.
Have you seen him?
I don't know if he's willing, but Kristen, we talked to him, he stops in and like always asks us to feed his cats and stuff. He's really attached to that. I don't think he's ready to part with it yet. Like, he
got it
really
kinda
loves
back
that,
door, yeah.
he loves that little building, and he always
It's starting
talks
to rust
about it.
out on the bottom. Needs some attention.
So maybe if we approached it right.
Thank you for coming up today.
Yeah,
Appreciate
thank you,
all the
guys.
time and expertise today.
Yes.
It's been
I
very
always
beneficial
say,
for us.
ideas are easy, ideas are the easy part. It's easy for me to spend your money. You heard that this morning, didn't you? No, we appreciate it. It's exciting, because we see the potential here, and you guys do. So, there's our contact info. We've got cards here too, if you guys want specific cards. Otherwise, if you don't have any questions, that's what we've got. Take these. Kristen, you want all these are all yours. Take the word finds if you want them, spread them around to your friends.
So we meet the first Thursday of every month at 5 o'clock. Do you guys want to come?
Well, no, maybe, you know, since you only show up once in a while. We can really use you.
We only show up once in a while too.
You can always call and email.
I think you need to have your meeting rep
We
Seriously.
talked about that.
You're already making that.
You guys can always call and email. Even if you're not here. Yeah. Well, seriously, there's always, you know, we enjoy getting her emails, but you don't have to be the only one that emails. Well, it comes in batches. Yeah, he just drifted around the house.
Ask her what she wants.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Cat.
Okay. All right, so,
Yeah.
just change the annual meeting, just call Barb and say, because she's the one that said it, that your annual meeting was gonna be your next meeting. So just tell her we can't do the annual meeting then. Just do it.
Or I can get it down.
Okay. Yeah, just change it.
Well, I can get it as an insert.
So,
We're supposed to be writing an article for the Grundy Register, but we're not sure what we're supposed to write that article about.
well,
We can get the bullet points on it.
We were gonna take over for her.
right, she was putting something in that, okay, they haven't put that one in.
So we have
ours
some
won't
time.
be- yeah,
So we
we've
can
got
wait and
time.
talk
So
about this
maybe
at our next
At our
meeting.
next meeting in
Okay.
April, we're gonna talk about what
Where
we're
to
gonna do
go.
next, where we're going. And then we talk about that.
It's like, I don't you think when that presentation, that presentation city council too, before and after was pretty powerful? Yeah. Because the one, I mean, they showed the building in seats, I think the seat center.
That we're gonna take that information off that poster.
Maybe we talk, maybe we talk about,
And that's the, that's
you know, the design service that was available, that True Value, what the True Value had done and market, and just do an article about that.
training.
And we can decide the next meeting.
I'd love to do a tour to another Main Street community in Brooklyn. Because I see when I go to workshops, is that enlightenment, that, you know, the spark that happened in the community.
Talk about Grundy
No,
Germany.
so they are considering designing the flower bed with the planters.
But you go into the communities and then you've seen what's actually happened and where they started from is no different than what we have. You know, but you see that transformation. You see
After they first take the course.
see that it's possible. There's a lot
Always
of
first.
They have.
my problem is that when it all happens.
The extension or the? Were you Master Gardener?
Well, I don't think they technically have, but I
Okay,
don't think
so
there's
then
anybody new signing up, like there's nobody that's taking the classes to do their outreach.
It's a little, yeah, they're all set in their ways, but they want, they want to be ready for change. Yeah. Yeah, Baptist church,
So,
yeah.
should we decide
Well, and it's usually a once a month.
that the landlord email out
Be good idea if they-
and we'll do that the landlord?
Next person that tells you they want it turned down.
Perfect.
No, I'll take them. I don't care. I've stood on the corner and gotten yelled at already, so.
Is that
Well, yeah, there's something.
No, and but I hope, what my hope is in 2 years, we're ready.